going to go ahead and get started, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Again, I'm Catherine Bracy. I'm the founder and executive director of the TechEquity Collaborative. We're here to talk to Conor Dougherty, who is the author of Golden Gates. Before we get into that, I just want to let you know that this event is part of Affordable Housing Week. We're partnering with Silicon Valley at Home on this event, and also to promote 35 plus other events on this very important topic. The message for Affordable Housing Month is that everyone deserves access to a safe, stable, and affordable home. And of course, that issue is more relevant than ever now. If you want to find out about those other events, you can visit siliconvalleyathome.org or affordablehousingmonth.org, and Herman will be dropping those links into the chat. Before we get to Conor, just a quick note about TechEquity for those of you who are new to the organization. We are a nonprofit based in Oakland that serves tech workers in California, mobilizing them around issues that we think will make a growing tech-driven economy work for everyone. We do three things with tech workers. We educate them, providing educational programming like this event and many others on the issue areas that we care about. We do advocacy campaigns to advance policy change that we think will make a growing tech economy work better for everyone, and we connect tech workers to the communities around them. And the issue areas that we work on are housing, obviously, the topic for this conversation today, and workforce and labor. And if you want to get more involved with TechEquity, you can check us out at techequitycollaborative.org. If you work in tech, we also encourage you to become a member so that we can really represent your voice in these policy debates in California, techequitycollaborative.org/membership. So we're going to get into this conversation with Conor now. Conor is a reporter for the New York Times writing on economic issues based here in the Bay Area. And he is and obviously one of those issues is housing, which is probably the top economic issue here in the Bay Area and California. And he has written a new book, which is out this spring called Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America. And we're really happy to welcome Conor.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here.
Sorry, we're all on Zoom.
Yeah, I took this time to actually finish the book, which was really good. It was a, not your typical dry sort of nonfiction reportage about the history of the housing crisis in California. It was much more narrative. It was a story. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why you decided to write the book to kick us off, and then tell us what it's about. What is the narrative arc of the story of housing in California?
So thank you for having me, and thank you for saying kind things. It being interesting, one of the reviews on Amazon I just saw the other day, which it said this felt like the show Parks and Recreation, which I liked that review because it was kind of a little bit what I was going for. But what I want to have a really great, smart answer about, oh, I was sitting there and I wanted to write this thing because of this, because of some smart reason. But really, I just I get interested in things that I think are important. And then I try to find ways to tell those, to illustrate those things I think are important in some way that seems interesting. And years ago, so I've been covering housing for a long time, and years ago, I had started to read a lot about how a lack of housing and the inability to build housing or the difficulty in building housing was a pressing issue for a great many places, notably the Bay Area. And I'd always wanted to write something about this, but it was so boring. It was like some combination of economic research and which was interesting, but it was not on its own interesting. And then kind of like a lot of developers complaining about how, the government was, the worst and would not allow them to do whatever they wanted and whatever. And even if there were shades of truth in some of that, it sort of felt like, well, this is not the right way to tell the story, because it feels a little, maybe one-sided is the wrong word, but of course the developer is going to complain, and of course an economist is going to say. So I ended up, I was, honestly just wasn't really writing any stories about this. I was writing stories about other things. And then one day I kind of started to see this YIMBY movement thing happening. I had met Sonia, and she had started to attract some funding.
Sonia Kraus, for
It
those
was
who
the,
haven't,
yes.
for those who, I mean, most of the people have read the book, I'm sure, from cover to cover. For those who
Anyway, my point is I was just looking for a way to illustrate this thing. And that's probably how I went into it. But really, as I kind of followed the story and tried to follow some tenants who were having a lot of trouble and new immigrants coming to the Bay Area who were had a huge housing insecurity, I kind of just tried to follow the concept of housing into as many different places as possible. And the story kind of took shape of that. I guess the arc of the story is, how do you create like a movement of people that want to solve this problem? And what does that look like? I think I went into it thinking, oh, that looks like something like this YIMBY movement. But then I basically came out of it thinking it looked like something more like a kind of combination YIMBY / tenants movement. And so at times, I think the book kind of focuses on the tension between those two things, which of course is less about housing than it is kind of wealth inequality and, entrenched racism and things like that. But housing was just kind of like it ended up becoming my view into those things. So I guess in the end, I think the story is like, here's a bunch of people trying to figure out how to solve this problem, and it's like really hard. You were saying though that it's different. Here's the way I think about it. You were saying it's not like your typical serious nonfiction or and one thing I think I thought about, the one thing I was very conscious of, and had some fights with my publisher about on a kind of structural level, is the typical nonfiction book ends with like some, like in some cases literally bullet points, but some kind of here's how we solve this kind of thing. And I was like insistent that I was not going to do that, that I just wanted to almost invert the structure and say, okay, here's a bunch of people working on these things. Like here's a nun working on a community land trust. Here's a tenant working to, keep her family from being homeless. Here's people working to build more, and in each case, it's like really hard. And so I felt like it was more realistic to sort of say, here's what it looks like when you actually try to do this.
Yeah.
As opposed to, here's my, 10-point plan.
Yeah, and I think, first of all, I forgot to say that if you have questions, we are going to get to them in the last like 15, 20 minutes. Please use the Q&A function to ask those questions. And my colleague Marion will be in there curating the questions and throwing them out to us later. So you can use the chat to kind of chat. And if you have any AV issues, Hermana's in the chat to help you with that. But if you have a question that you want to pose to Conor, please use the Q&A function. So, Conor, to that point, I think that's really interesting because, for those of us who work in housing politics or on, housing advocacy, it's almost like, obviously it is complicated and complex, but the real stickiness is not really in the policy dynamics. Honestly, it's almost like that 10-point plan exists and everybody kind of knows what it is. The stickiness is really,
it's like 40 years old.
Yeah, we kind of know what we have to do to get out of this crisis, and the stickiness is really around the personal and political and power dynamics of actually getting that stuff done. And there's and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but like housing is an issue in particular that is so fraught with all of those sort of like identity and politics and power dynamics that it becomes really hard to do anything big on them. But it's interesting that you said, looking at this through the lens of that sort of like the people who are working on this issue, there are millions, hundreds of thousands of people who are working on housing. You chose a few very interesting characters. I'm wondering if you can say like how you narrowed in on what characters you wanted to focus on, and also, maybe this isn't a fair question, but who are the villains and who are the heroes of the story?
Yes. The whole villain thing, I felt like if I so just to address the villain thing head on, um, I felt like there were people living in a level of cognitive dissonance that seemed um, I thought that some of the arguments from some of the single family homeowner groups felt fundamentally wrong and dissonant in a way that they should know that they basically should know that they're wrong. So for instance, I was talking to somebody in Cupertino once, and they, had all this, this isn't our neighbor. The typical, we didn't sign up for this kind of thing. But I was like, but you did sign up for this because you have a giant headquarters for a giant company, and through all the community processes that you that you kind of hold as true and dear, you built what is the equivalent of a gigantic skyscraper in the middle of town, and that comes with consequences. And saying that you didn't know those consequences I basically don't believe it. It's like the classic, you're either incompetent or you're corrupt, like whichever one is not acceptable, and so I did feel like some of the Silicon Valley cities in particular felt like they had policies that were truly destructive and people should basically know that they're destructive. Like the jobs housing imbalances in Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Cupertino are truly extraordinary. And it's interesting. The Silicon Valley is a place I cannot find a great example of anything as extreme as that anywhere. And I don't just mean
in the country or in California.
In the country. I mean, so Manhattan, which is kind of like your classic place where the daytime population is so much larger than the nighttime population, is full of office buildings. There's, multiple train lines, ferries, and bridges, that are designed solely to pack the place with workers during the day and get them out of there at night. Even Manhattan has like a slightly more than 2 jobs per housing unit ratio. Palo Alto has like 4. Cupertino and Menlo Park have like 3. Those are numbers that they don't sound like they're a lot, but that is such an unfathomably large number. I remember one time when I was doing very early reporting for the book, I was trying to get out of Palo Alto, which I don't go to that much. At like, I think it was like 11. It was like 4:30, and the street was so packed that it was like people were turning off their cars and just like sitting there for a half an hour. And this was like just to get to a stop sign to get to the freeway. And it was something like I'd never seen other than like a natural disaster where it's like everyone's trying to get out of town at once. And I was sort of like, this is all the community processes that you say are so important to maintaining your community. You went through all of those to create this situation. And I think that you have to kind of own up to it.
Yeah. So, I guess you talk to a lot of those folks. We'll call them NIMBYs. What is the psychology that's happening there? Like, how do they rationalize this to themselves? I think that if you're telling like in a nutshell story of California politics, one way to tell it is, or California housing politics in particular, is a lot of on paper liberal progressive people who, when it comes to housing, are extremely exclusionary and conservative. And they have to be doing, like, I always wonder, like, what are the mental gymnastics they have to be playing with themselves to like square that circle and rationalize that mindset?
I think, and this is fair, people don't feel like every problem is their problem to solve.
Even when they approve the Apple headquarters.
Yeah, well, I think people, that part I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, but
has anyone just been straight out like, we're greedy and we want the tax base without having to deal with the other?
I've never heard anyone say that. And that would be, I think, well, like all things in systems, people have a set of incentives. And once those incentives they will act in accordance with those. So for instance, I was in if Prop 13 didn't exist, cities would have some incentive to, even if it was unpopular, they would be weighing things like, oh, okay, people are complaining about this particular development, but I'm getting it on the other end from these teachers unions. Therefore, some of the time they would approve a housing, a tax generating housing project. And other times they wouldn't. But my point is there would just be this there would be like a financial counterbalance that would just like cause people to make different decisions. So I don't know, I guess I think a lot of these things are kind of like systems that once they bake in a certain incentive, you're just going to find every way you can to kind of live your best interest. I mean, it's like, I don't have a great analogy, but I mean, it's like the kind of classic thing. It's very hard to do something, whatever you're thinking about it, it's very hard to do something that's not in your self-interest. I forgot what your first question even was, but
I did too.
I don't want to dodge the villain question.
Oh, well, we kind of got the villain out on the table. I mean, I guess the first question was how you chose the characters you chose to focus on.
Well, I guess I chose people who, I mean, this is a less interesting answer politically, but I mean, I chose people who seemed like they had stories and were like willing to tell them. You know what I mean? There's a lot of people who are very squeamish about telling their stories, and I understand why, and I totally appreciate and, can sympathize with that, but then I just like have to move on. It's like, sorry, And I do spend a lot of time, as a reporter, talking to people who like kind of half want to tell their story, and I'm sort of like, I can't. It's sort of an all or nothing. I mean, for the kind of reporting I do, and that and that's just the kind of the way it has to be if you're going to tell an immersive story. I was conscious of finding people who would have a beginning, middle, and end, and that whatever that end was, it would be distinct. So in the case of a tenant, I wanted to follow someone through an eviction. I set, or an economic displacement. So I set up in my head, I was like, I'm going to find someone when they first get a really bad rent increase, and I'm going to see what happens. And I set up that scenario. I set up all the reporting around finding that scenario and being able to follow it. Then in the case of Sonia and the YIMBY thing,
you just please say who Sonia is for those who don't know.
Sonia Trauss was the creator of this group called the Bay Area Renters Federation, or BARF. And she had become a very early firebrand, a very early kind of YIMBY person who was going to city board of supervisors and city council meetings and saying, we need to build more housing. And she started to attract all these followers. And ultimately that kind of through some morphed into the whole YIMBY movement, really in California we see today. I mean, it's kind of crazy. When I first met Sonia, Brian Hanlon, who now runs California YIMBY, was just kind of this guy who showed up to meetings with her and had his own plans for how to, but all of these people were kind of together at these meetings. Laura Foote, who now runs YIMBY Action, was sort of this, she was working at some like wine company and would come over to board of supervisors meetings like during her time or lunch hour or something. So all these people who were sitting there at this very beginning had all these different ideas for how they were going to do this. I ended up wanting to follow Sonia, because she's a character and has some personality quirks that made her interesting to follow, but also B, the kind of classic narrative of like, someone's going to run for office, will they win, will they lose? Like, it's just so distinct. And then in the case of and then there was a suburban story, and that one, this place Lafayette, and that one was sort of like, does this thing get built or not? And so I think in every case, I was trying to find a beginning, middle, finding stories that would have a natural beginning, middle, and end, so that the reader would know where the story ended. And even though the story, like in theory, doesn't end, because we like still have a housing problem and all these other things, I thought that it was important that the particular narratives would have a beginning, middle, and end. And there was actually a bunch of other narratives I did look at along the way that I cut because it was too like, what's happening here? You know what? I didn't have enough space to see what was going to happen. And so I couldn't put it into a more familiar narrative frame.
Yeah, that feels like every story in housing, very convoluted with no
But I
clear.
mean, if you're a tenant and it's like, am I going to lose my place? That is
Yeah,
like a very distinct story. And then if, an election, anyway, I'm just saying wrapping that artificial frame around it felt important so that you could contain it in your head.
yeah. I mean, we talked about Apple a little bit. Obviously, we have an interest in tech, and I'm curious. You mention it a little bit in the book, but don't go into. It's definitely not central to your story. I'm curious what you think about the role that the tech industry, the growth of the tech industry in the Bay Area and California has on the story.
Um, it's hard to separate, as you guys and your organization to some extent is emblematic of. It's not always so easy to separate the companies. Well, it's not always so easy to combine the companies with the people who work for them. They are kind of separate groups, right? So I am sure Apple, the company, would love to have lower housing prices and more development in Cupertino. But a lot of the people in Cupertino who are, defensive of how the neighborhood is work for Apple, right? So those two things, right? You see what I'm saying? Like, there are plenty of, a good number of people in Silicon Valley who want to maintain a low density environment are themselves either retired tech workers or current tech workers, or at least are related to or connected to in some way that engine, right? So as for the companies themselves, I think they are starting to get interested in this, but it just took a while for them to realize how bad it was. I think that there's also, and I see the same thing with climate change activists. I think that if you're a big enough entity, you're a Google, you're an Apple, I think they almost find it, for lack of a better term, beneath them to go mix it up at a city council meeting. I remember I was at a meeting for Google trying to present its new headquarters at the Mountain View City Council when they wanted to expand their headquarters. And this is probably a little harsh, but it was really embarrassing. They didn't know how the meeting worked. They didn't know what the time limits were. They said it was just very obvious that they'd never been to a city council meeting. And if they had, they just hadn't paid attention. Whereas then you would see like some of the developers and some of the other people, which say what you will about them, like they were very conscious of how the meeting went and where the clock was. It said whether you had 10 minutes and whatever. And so there was like a kind of arrogance on their part that they were sort of like, we're just going to go down to this public space and present our thing and they'll just like have to deal with us. Whereas everyone else at that meeting was just like highly conscious of like, oh, this is how this space worked. And I feel like that, like watching that play out, I mean, it was crazy. They were like, okay, your 10 minutes are up. And they were like, what? I thought both of us got 10 minutes. And they're like, no, the company gets 10 minutes to talk. It doesn't matter which of the two of you get to talk. Like, you don't just get to show up with 3 people and get 30 minutes, so things as basic as that. And I felt like inside of that little scene I saw was kind of emblematic of like, I shouldn't even have to be here talking to you right now. That, this is so beneath me. And I think you see the same thing with climate change activists. I remember once calling a big climate organization, and they were beyond just saying like vaguely, we think density is important. They just didn't want to be operating at that local level. And so I think sometimes there's just like a reluctance to take local government seriously below a certain level. Maybe they'll go mix it up at the LA City Council or whatever. But I think people don't recognize that our land policy and our housing policy is functionally made by a million city councils. Obviously there are federal government things that determine a lot of that, but that is who is by and large determining like where, how much, and at what cost we're building housing. and I guess maybe that's the message of this book, is that like all these decisions are being made by these little tiny bodies, and you can't just like ignore them and wish that that weren't so, and hope that you can grab some big federal lever, or you know, that this is what's going to be, this is where this is going to be decided. So
yeah. I mean, I think, you know, I'm interested in what you had to say about like the distinction between the company and the people who work at the company, and how those two things end up leading together. Like, obviously, we think that the people who work at the company in aggregate have a lot of power. And I'm sure that—
but they have power as people, right? I'm sure that
Yeah.
you have people, I mean, you see it all the time, right? Where if you, there are people I've met who consider themselves like dyed-in-the-wool socialists who want, you know, whatever. They think the YIMBYs are the worst thing in the world. And then, of course, they're like, oh, I work at YouTube, right? You know, and on the flip side, there are people you will meet who are kind of on a more working class background. And they're like, oh, I want to own a home. This is something I want. I don't really want to apply for my housing. I'm not interested in public housing. I want a system where I get in the normal way, you know? So I guess what I'm saying is like, it's hard to ascribe an ideological like position to a company.
Yeah.
To the workers of the company.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder what you think then the responsibility of these companies is to, you know, solve the crisis.
So I hate this question. No, I don't mean it. What I mean is that I don't like the idea that Google and Facebook and all these people are supposed to solve the problem, because I don't really think it's their role. Now, should they be paying a tax that is consummate with their size, like, you know, that reflects their size and influence on a region? Absolutely, right? But so there's this city council meeting you can go watch on YouTube, and it's where Apple is kind of in the final stages to get approval for the spaceship headquarters they have now. And Steve Jobs, by the way, very different from Google, Steve Jobs himself shows up to this meeting and is like, you know, goes to the, you know,
arms and pants off of everybody.
Yeah, goes to the you know, goes to the whatever you call podium to kind of give his public comment. And he says, you know, all this stuff. And you know, we're growing, we need this space, we want to stay in Cupertino, blah, 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 blah. And the city council then asks him every right question. They say, who's going to pay for affordable housing? How are we going to handle all these extra workers? How are we going to deal with all the infrastructure? So they ask all these questions. And that's another reason why I find it a little bit, villainous is a little much, but those were your words, not mine. But, you know, because I was like, okay, so we now know, like, people were very conscious of what the problems could potentially be. They sit there and ask every right question, and then apparently just ignore them because they, you know, didn't build a ton of housing, and they until yesterday were fighting this Valco thing. So, which is a potential housing development nearby.
Yeah.
So at one point, they kind of say, will Apple pay for this affordable housing? Which is the typical thing you hear around the Bay Area. And he says something like, no, that's not we pay taxes, you guys handle this stuff, you know, whatever, right? Now, there's two ways I've seen people react to that comment. One is, wow, this just shows how arrogant they are, blah, 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 right? But I feel like it's the opposite. I feel like it's like, yes, he gave the exact right answer. And the city council people, though, should be like, yes, and that's why we're raising your taxes, or that's why we're going to have a head tax, or that's what, you know, and there's this, it's like, he's right. It shouldn't be their job, but also they should make a contribution relative to their impact, whatever that is. And I guess basically, here's the answer to your question. I think that tech companies and large employers generally, whether they're McKesson or anyone else who's now leaving, but should pay, or should have some tax that we all decide is fair and, and reflects the size a little bit. But I think when you start singling out specific companies to just pay for something out of the goodness of their hearts, not only is that, I just think you're setting yourself up for like a bad situation, because again, you're like relying on them.
Yeah.
It just seems like the wrong way to think about it. It's kind of like the classic thing where people say, should we have philanthropy or should we just have like a competent government? You know what I mean? And I'm like, I'm on the like, just have a competent government side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And, part of me asking that question was to sort of set you up for that answer. I honestly couldn't really, I mean, that's basically our position, which is one of the reasons as TechEquity, our work is not to like, we don't advocate at the companies to do more. We organize people who work at the companies to use their civic power and act in their role as citizens to affect policy change. And we sometimes get, criticism for that, like, oh, you don't want to anger your corporate masters or whatever. But, my response is like, nobody elected Mark Zuckerberg. And it's a sort of dereliction of your democratic duty to just put this all onto like corporate leaders to solve this problem for us instead of, taking responsibility ourselves for solving what are effectively public problems. And if the solution is like tax Mark Zuckerberg and Tim Cook from here to kingdom come, I'm all for it. But it can't just be like, oh, please, Mr. Zuckerberg, will you spend $1 billion on housing, which by the way, doesn't go that far. So anyway, that's my soapbox.
No, I agree. And what I totally agree with you. And not only that, the mindset there is such I think you can reframe it much the way you have, which is like, it's such a defeatist mindset. It's like a mindset that says when Steve Jobs walks into that city council meeting to say, you have to do this, that the city council people who functionally control all the land he wants to build something on, right, that they're these little lambs who cannot challenge him. And I'm kind of like, no, they could totally decide to change. They have a lot more power than they are, and it's their refusal to use it that is yeah. And I guess and just to kind of back that up, what I'm saying is that we are saying to them that they have no choice but to approve anything Steve Jobs says on exactly his terms, and that Steve Jobs should be nice and Mark Zuckerberg should be nice and just volunteer to build affordable housing because they should, right? Yeah. And I'm like, anyway, so here's a perfect example of this though. Amazon went around the country and did this HQ2 thing, which I'm sure everyone on this call knows, that they went around the country and said, hey, we're thinking about building a second headquarters. What can you give us cities? And after this year-long charade, really, they decide they're going to go to New York and Washington. Then New York freaks out and says, we're not going to give you any we're not going to give you any discounts. And Amazon says they're going to pull out of New York because the deal fell apart or whatever. Then they quietly open an office with 1,500 people on it just shortly after. And then they go and buy the Lord and Taylor building for like, I forget, some large amount of money to expand more. So what that tells me is they were always going to go to New York, that New York had some strategic importance to them that was worth much more than any tax break they could get. And I think the same thing is true of, people in the Silicon Valley. There's the place makes the companies more than the companies make the place. And that means I think that the political leverage is more in the government's hands than they let on.
So I want to get to one more kind of topical area before we open it up to questions. And so that's also a cue to folks who are listening. If you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A function and Marion will be surfacing those to us in a bit. One thing that I'm really interested in right now is like a dynamic of the housing debate, I guess, is this sort of dynamic between renters and homeowners. And that I feel like historically, and you talk about this a little bit, actually, you had a good quote. I'm going to read from the book, if you don't mind. You said, America is willing to subsidize as much debt as homeowners can gorge themselves on, but poor renters, the majority of whom live in market rate apartments, are a penny ante side issue unworthy of being prioritized. And that sort of speaks to the thing I alluded to earlier, which is, how much of the problem we have solving this problem is wrapped up in the mythology of the American dream and the American dream's connection to homeownership, in the sense that, if you're good and the story you were telling about this working class person who wants to do things the normal way, which means getting in the normal way, which means homeownership, and that we cling to that so there's so much emotional resonance in that. But we're now in a world where, that path doesn't really exist for anyone my age or younger. And everybody who was like doing the right things and on the normal path economically, like went to the 4-year college and has the good job, it doesn't have an opportunity, at least in the Bay Area, to buy a home, to be a homeowner. And I'm wondering what you think about how that changes this dynamic between, the poor renter who is kind of stigmatized and, I think, wrongly, like there's injustice in this, there's all kinds of like racial undertones to this as well, but like they did something wrong to be a perpetual renter. And so therefore they kind of deserve what they get. And all of the welfare we hand out as a country, the way we look at this, should be going to homeowners who are doing, quote unquote, the right thing. How does that change given the world we live in, where homeownership is not an option for most people?
So there's a couple different things in that, and they're all kind of mixed up together. So one is that a lot of people do leave California, hundreds of thousands a year, to go to places like Phoenix and Dallas, and almost specifically to either get home ownership or to get a place that they think is more, that they think is bigger and whatever, right? That is more how they think they should be living. That's happening a lot. It's probably going to continue. It'll probably actually slow down over the next few years, because during a recession, fewer people leave because they don't have anywhere to go. But that is happening, and that's part of the natural way of things. So there are plenty of people leaving the Bay Area for home ownership after they get to a certain age or have kids or whatever. Christine, I was going to say, one of the people in the book who I followed, Christina Johnson, who was running against Sonia, at the end of the book, I called her for fact checking and stuff. She's like, "Oh, I live in Denver now." And it was like that story. She was like, "Oh, well, I have a kid, and it just made life easier." And right. Okay. So that is happening, and will continue to happen. The second question, and the second part of that is like this sort of idea of home ownership generally. I try to think about, I've thought a lot about this and I haven't really figured out my thoughts about it, but like, if you see what's happening, we almost have two separate things happening. We have tenant rights, people pushing tenants' rights in a direction that is moving being a tenant more like being a homeowner, except for that you wouldn't have equity, but you would have a level of stability that would be normally associated with a homeowner. You would have, if you see what the tenants' rights movement is pushing towards, it's like a more predictable increase in the rent, i.e. rent control, which is what a 30-year fixed mortgage does. And then you have some tenancy, that it's very hard to kick you out, right? So that is kind of essentially trying to bestow what is home ownership on a tenant, to give them that level of stability. So I think that when we think about home ownership, aside from the wealth stuff, which we can talk about separately, I feel like people want a stable home, and they want to be in the neighborhood that they want to be in. And then they also want some ability to leave it, meaning they want to be able to change as their life changes, right? And so I try not to over fixate. So finding a way to do that I think that you're going to probably, if more people rent and more of them are higher income, they're inevitably, just through the political process, going to start demanding that. So San Francisco, for instance, has a very strong tenants' rights movement, but that tenants' rights movement probably reflects its wealth, almost certainly reflects its wealth, and the wealth of those renters more than it does some imagined social justice for, I mean, it does have the benefit of being beneficial to lower income tenants, but the real reason that power exists has more to do with the income of those renters and their political power and organization than it does the sort of stated goals, right? And so I think that you'll start to, if we have more renters and more high income renters, you'll start to see a system that looks more like home ownership for them, minus again the equity. So I think that's where we're going. Now, I will say one thing, and this is just kind of gets into kind of the wealth inequality piece of America. One of the reasons that this gets sort of wonky, but homeownership used to be available to a pretty large slice of people, as you say, and that had all sorts of what?
White people.
Yeah, yes, though. I mean, 2/3 of Americans own their homes. So that is, and if you're talking about the 40s and the 50s, that's obviously true, right? Anyway, what is happening? Anyway, so here's what I'm saying. There were all sorts of reasons that home ownership used to be like almost like this, like a cheaper form of home ownership, was like a check on the housing market. So one of the reasons rent control wasn't super effective in the old days, this is maybe not necessarily true now, is that a home was a good escape valve. Meaning if a landlord raised their rent too much, the person would just leave and go buy a home. Like that used to be a home ownership and like a rental rate were close enough that it was almost like this natural mechanism, but that's like no longer true now. So the fact that home ownership has become so expensive has actually distorted how our market even works in all sorts of weird ways that I don't think we've totally figured out yet. But
I want to we want to move to Q&A because we only have 15 minutes left. I do think I disagree with you slightly, or I think you're underestimating the role that emotion plays in homeownership and how much people tie that to some sort of like striving identity thing that makes it a lot harder to get to, some of those policy outcomes that benefit renters. But I'm going to call on Marion now.
Yes.
To queue up.
I will say just on that note, but we don't have to talk about it. I think sometimes in politics, you got to kind of lean into the emotional stuff. In ways that people don't like doing. I've thought about this a lot with like socialism. There's all sorts of ways that you could like get a lot of what quote unquote socialist outcomes if you just didn't label them that. But a lot of people are insistent on labeling them that. And I'm always like, if the problem is the label, but you can get all what you want with a different label, why are you fixating on the label?
Yeah.
Right? And so if you call it home ownership or you call it renting or you find some middle ground between the two, selling it is like part of the thing. And
yeah.
I think, anyway, so.
Marion, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Can you kick us some questions?
Absolutely. All right. Conor, what are your thoughts about the interactions and or overlap between racism and NIMBYism?
They're high. And like all things, so there's a great book, there's numerous books about the African-American experience in the West. They're all very good and very distinct from other places. And they use the term polite racism, which has been used many times. So there's a whole piece in my book about how there was this pretty vicious Prop 14 fight. Prop 14 was essentially a statewide segregation bill that would have encoded, it was in 1963 and it would have, in 1964 rather, that would have encoded in the California Constitution the right to not sell or rent your property to someone based on race. So essentially it encodes the right to segregation in the Constitution. It actually passed overwhelmingly, but was thrown out on constitutional grounds. At the exact same time that was happening in California, the Deep South was like, you know, huge civil rights fights, and you know, the George Wallace had given this, you know, famous or infamous segregation now, segregation forever speech. So I think that the racial dynamics of, like so many things in America, of this problem, they get less and less disgusting and less you know, surface level, but they become but the ways in which they play out become more and more creative. And so I think that as long as we have a wealth gap that is highly racialized, and as long as the mechanisms to rectify that race gap, access to good schools, ability to get a home, you know, access to jobs at Google and Facebook, a representation of jobs at, you know, at high companies, then anything we do that shakes out along income grounds will probably be inherently, I don't know if inherently racist is the wrong word, but it would inherently continue, it would keep the racial gaps going, it would compound them. So I don't know what I mean. So this is a long way of saying, as long as it's very hard to get to schools, elite school district, as long as it's really hard to live near good jobs and higher paying, you know, industries, we will compound our race problems and our racial inequities in this country.
Great.
Right, Marion?
A lot of people have been asking, unsurprisingly, about the impact of COVID-19 on housing in California. People have been asking about the rent strikes, about whether or not our political leaders will decide to focus more on housing and housing density. The NIMBY's, you know, talk of housing density in relation to COVID-19. So I'll just kind of leave it open-ended. How do you think COVID-19 is going to impact housing in California?
I don't think that a lot of the political stuff will turn out to be as important as the economic stuff. We're going to have trouble with banks, which means we're going to have trouble with people building homes. So that's going to be a problem. One thing I'm noticing is that people's positions are just hardened by COVID-19. You know, people who are against higher density housing are saying COVID-19 appears, you know, this just shows why density is horrible. And people who are pro-density are saying, you know, this just shows why we need more homes. I will say there's a ton of evidence to show, and we're trying to find more, that overcrowded housing seems to be much worse than dense housing on its own. There is a example I have in a possible upcoming story in which there's a neighborhood that is had very, very, very high infection rates, but there is a affordable housing complex tucked into that neighborhood, and their people per bedroom is much lower because it's only a third of their income, so they don't have to overcrowd to afford the rent, and the infection rates in that specific building are startlingly low, even though they sit into in a pocket. Anyway, so that may or may not matter, right? Once people bring, as Catherine said, once people bring this emotion into politics, and they just, you know, I don't think it'll change. I think the two sides will still fight with each other, and it will, each will think that they've had their position bolstered, and it will all just continue. As for the rent strikes, we'll see how it goes. I mean, I think it's totally smart and interesting. They don't appear to be super effective yet, but it'll just be interesting to see how it plays out. I mean, shit, Cheesecake Factory is on a rent strike right now. So it seems like, you know, everyone in the economy has realized that they have a ton of leverage. I was on a conference call.
Cheesecake Factory is too big to fail.
I was on a conference call with a big retail, big real estate investment trust, and I don't know exactly who this is, but they said in the call that a large company that you've totally heard of and is totally creditworthy, which they said they have no indication that they have any are refusing to pay their rent in a bunch of office buildings. So there's a ton of people doing this at every level. It is kind of fun to see gigantic corporations and kind of radical leftists have the exact same strategy. So how often does that happen? So anyway.
What do you think are the chances of a revised version of SB 50 passing in either this year or next? And how do you think COVID-19 impacts that?
That ship has sailed. I don't see how you can introduce, for reasons, I'm not like a great political prognosticator. I don't get into the like intrigue and the like who's up, who's down of politics. I'm more like, I work for the business desk. I cover the economy. The ways in which politics affects that is kind of my focal point. So I'm less good about Sacramento and whatever. So with that grain of salt introduced, I just don't see how you can introduce what sounds like the same thing for the fourth time. But on the other hand, this SB 35 law that Scott Wiener passed a while ago seems to have turned out to be more effective than people thought it was. It's faced some legal challenges and gotten through both of them.
We're talking about the 80, which
it's one where it essentially makes affordable housing by right in California, but it says that if you are underbuilt on certain types of housing, which is almost all lower income and middle income housing, you can just get approval for it ministerially, which means you can go to like the building department and be like, I just want a permit. And
you don't have to get approval from the city. Basically.
No kind of legislative approval whatsoever.
Right.
So that, and it's worked twice. Also, these ADU laws, I don't know how they will play out, but I mean, in some cases, they represent a doubling or tripling of density in certain neighborhoods. I mean, I live in Rockridge, Oakland, which is, seen as the kind of like NIMBY neighborhood of Oakland. And in theory, with some of these new ADU laws, someone could double or triple the density of a neighborhood like that. That's not, I seeing if that actually happens. If that really happened, it would be, it would start to make some kind of dent, and it would also it would run the experiment a little bit to see what it looked like. So I think there's a lot of laws on the books that anyway, so that's my answer. I just don't see how the exact same thing could be proposed again.
Cool. It seems like we have time for about one more question. So I'm going to end on a broader note. What takeaways could a policymaker or influential change maker benefit from reading your book?
They could, this is very self-serving, they could learn to think more like a reporter, which is that my goal is to kind of just is to take theory and things, and economic studies and things like that, and say they have a role, but they don't have the ultimate role. And so I think people are very, I guess this is a long way of saying, don't think the experts are always right, but don't think the experts are always wrong either. You can go and find out a lot if you actually sort of ask hard questions about what's happening. And I see this, I mean, this is going to sound like, limp, but I see this on both sides. It turns out, one of the narratives I followed in the book was there's this group of lower income tenants and they get displaced. But then I went and by a very high rent increase. And then I went and saw who moved in, and it was like another group of lower income tenants that had just packed the house with about 3 times the number of people that had been previously living there. This is actually really common. Urban Displacement Project and a million studies show this, that, and so when I was kind of talking to some of the tenants' rights people about, what about building, what about, like you can see this pressure. And so they didn't really want to talk about that, and so, and the flip side is, you know, if you build a bunch of luxury units, they're not going to help those people either. There's just this kind, you know, so I think that asking yourself, like, hey, I have all this, you know, I have all this kind of faith in this particular piece of legislation. And I think you should just be able to ask yourself, I think people should ask themselves, like, hey, is this thing working like I thought it was? And if it's not, like, to kind of like reevaluate that. One of the things that I became very disappointed with, but I guess I kind of understand it as I was doing this book, is advocates on either side, they start off, you know, I'd like to believe they start off with some like belief that this is the right way to do something, right? And their motives are pure and whatever. But over time, it feels like, and I'm you know, in another conversation, I'd love to hear what Catherine thought about this, but it feels like people, once they get, you know, kind of baked into something, they start to become advocates for a particular policy rather than like advocates for like a particular outcome. You know, they're like, you know, we are the people who fought for this thing and we got it. And even if this thing is like not at all doing what we thought it would, they just, that's their thing. They can't go back on it. You know, they just, you know, and I, you know, I see this a lot with the environmental movement, right? Like where there is like essentially preponderance of evidence that shows that many of California's environmental laws perpetuate sprawl, encourage sprawl. And like you bring this up to people and they just like do not want to talk about it because, you know, like because anything that moves backwards is a threat, right? And you see this on, you know, affordable housing stuff. You see this on every side of every issue because
Conor, we're
anyway, I will let you go, but
at 1 o'clock. Appreciate the thoughtful answer. Want to let everybody know, first of all, where you can buy the book. So I think Marian or Herman are gonna drop some links in the chat for those of you who are interested in purchasing the book from your local bookseller. Encourage you to read it and share it. And Conor, any other sort of parting suggestions if people want to follow up or learn more?
No, I don't think so. Please buy it from your local bookstore. If you want to review it kindly on Amazon or Goodreads, that's lovely too. But you know, I hope that people feel like they learned something and had a good time reading it. There's also a million other great housing books out there, but we can save that for another chat.
Yeah. I can vouch for the fact that it's very entertaining. So I highly encourage you to read it. Also, if you want to check out other events that are related to Affordable Housing Week, go to siliconvalleyathome.org or sorry, Affordable Housing Month, affordablehousingmonth.org or siliconvalleyathome.org. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next event. Thank you, Conor.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.